I never imagined that after 42 years of teaching children how to think, my own children would one day sit across from me and argue over what my life was worth. The words that opened that morning were not congratulations, not pride, not even gratitude for a lifetime spent in classrooms filled with chalk dust and laughter, but something far colder, something that made the air in my living room feel suddenly unfamiliar. I had just retired the week before, closing the final chapter of a career that began when I was 23 years old, back when lesson plans were handwritten and chalkboards were still black instead of white. I thought retirement would feel like relief, like warmth, like finally being allowed to breathe after decades of responsibility, but instead it felt like sitting in the middle of a storm I did not see coming. My name is Evelyn Brooks, and I am 70 years old. That morning, I had made coffee the way I always did, 2 teaspoons of sugar, a splash of milk, nothing fancy, just routine. I remember standing in my kitchen looking out the window at the quiet suburban street where I had lived for over 30 years, thinking how strange it was that time could move so fast and so slowly at the same moment. When I heard the front door open, I thought maybe my son Michael had come to surprise me, or maybe my daughter Sarah had finally decided to visit without rushing back to her busy life. Instead, all 3 of them arrived together, Michael, Sarah, and Daniel, my youngest, stepping into my home with expressions that did not match the occasion I had imagined. There were no hugs that lasted longer than a second, no warmth that lingered. Instead, there was a kind of tension I could not immediately name, like everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first. I offered them coffee, trying to fill the silence the way I always had, but they barely touched it. Then Michael leaned forward slightly, clearing his throat in a way that made my stomach tighten before he even spoke. It started with a question that sounded practical on the surface, almost polite, but carried something sharp underneath it. "Mom," he said, "now that you've retired, have you thought about how you're going to manage your pension?" I remember blinking at him, not because I didn't understand the words, but because I didn't understand why it was the first thing he wanted to talk about after 42 years of my working life had just ended. Before I could answer, Sarah interrupted, her voice faster, more urgent, as if she had been rehearsing this moment. She said something about planning, about fairness, about making sure everything was organized properly, but her eyes never quite met mine. Daniel, who had always been the quiet one, finally spoke too, and what he said turned the conversation from uncomfortable to unmistakably alarming. They weren't asking about my health, or how I felt after retiring, or whether I was adjusting to being home after decades of early mornings and late nights. They were discussing numbers, percentages, access. It was then I realized they weren't talking to me as a mother anymore, but as something else entirely, something that had value attached to it. I sat back in my chair, my hands still wrapped around my coffee mug, feeling the warmth fade from it as quickly as it faded from the room. I had spent my entire life believing that love inside a family was constant, that it deepened with time, that it survived even when life became complicated. But that morning, I saw something different forming in the space between my children, something transactional, something I was not prepared to name out loud. Michael finally said it clearly, though his tone tried to soften the edges. He said they needed to discuss who would be responsible for my pension. Not share, not help manage, but take responsibility, as if I was no longer the owner of my own life's work. The room felt smaller after that sentence, like the walls had moved closer without anyone touching them. I remember looking at each of them slowly, searching for some sign that I had misunderstood, that this was a conversation about logistics and not possession. But what I saw instead was calculation, careful and deliberate, like they were already dividing something that had not yet been formally split. I had taught children for decades how to read meaning, beyond words, how to understand tone, how to notice what is not said. And in that moment, I realized my own children had learned something else entirely. They had learned how to negotiate with silence, how to treat family as structure rather than connection. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse them of anything. I simply placed my coffee cup down on the table, the sound softer than I expected, and I waited. Because sometimes, silence is not weakness. Sometimes, it is the beginning of understanding what you are really sitting in front of. The silence after my children's words did not feel like an ending, but like a space stretching too wide to ignore. I remember sitting there with my hands resting on the table, still feeling the faint warmth of the coffee cup I had set down, while my mind tried to reconcile what I had just heard with everything I believed about family. Outside, the morning light had not changed, the same soft California sun spilling through the kitchen window of my suburban home in Sacramento, but inside, something had shifted in a way I could not reverse. Michael was the first to speak again, as if uncomfortable with the weight of what he had introduced. He leaned back slightly, adjusting his posture, and tried to soften his tone, saying something about planning ahead and making sure everything is handled responsibly. But the words no longer reached me the same way. They sounded rehearsed, carefully chosen, like he had already had this conversation in his mind before ever stepping into my house. Sarah was the one who kept glancing at me now, her fingers tapping lightly against the arm of the chair, a habit she had since she was a teenager when she was nervous or impatient. She finally said that it was normal for families to organize financial matters after retirement, that it was just practical thinking, nothing emotional. But there was emotion in the room, even if they were all trying to avoid naming it. Daniel, who had always been quieter, finally slid a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and placed it gently on the table. It was not dramatic in the way he presented it. No sudden movement, no raised voice, just a quiet placement. That made it more unsettling. He said it was just an outline, something they had put together to help structure things. I did not touch it immediately. I looked at it the same way I used to look at exam papers when I taught students, understanding that sometimes the real test is not in the questions, but in what the questions assume about you. My life had been reduced to an outline on paper in front of my own children. I remember asking them, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, when exactly they had started thinking of my pension as something that needed to be assigned like a task. The question did not sound angry. It sounded tired. That was the truth I noticed even as I spoke it. Michael responded first, saying they were only trying to make sure I would be taken care of, but the phrase landed differently now. Taken care of. It no longer sounded like love. It sounded like management. Sarah added that I should not worry, that they were doing this because they cared, but her eyes flicked toward the paper on the table more often than toward me. I realized then that their concern was not centered on my well-being, but on something I represented. Years of teaching had given me the ability to read patterns in behavior, to notice repetition in tone, and what I saw now was not confusion or sudden change, but alignment. They were aligned with each other, not with me. I stood up slowly, not because I was angry, but because I needed distance to think clearly. I walked toward the kitchen window and looked outside at the familiar street where neighbors walked dogs and children rode bicycles before school. And for a moment, I tried to remember the last conversation we had as a family that was not about responsibility, money, or obligation. I could not find one easily. When I turned back, they were still watching me, waiting for a reaction, expecting either resistance or agreement. I gave neither. Instead, I asked a simpler question. I asked if any of them had considered what I wanted. The question hung there longer than any of their explanations. No one answered immediately. That silence told me more than anything they had said so far. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of omission, of something not previously included in their thinking. I returned to my chair, not because I accepted what they were saying, but because I needed to understand how I had become a subject in a conversation I did not recognize. The paper remained untouched between us, like an object that belonged to a different version of my life, one I had not agreed to enter yet. And in that moment, I began to realize that what I was witnessing was not just a discussion about money. It was a shift in how they saw me, and possibly how long they had seen me that way without my noticing. The following morning did not bring clarity, but instead a heavier kind of silence that seemed to settle into every corner of my house. I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun fully reached the kitchen window, and for a moment I lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of a home that had become too quiet for comfort. There were no children running through the hallway, no hurried footsteps before work, only the soft ticking of the clock in the living room marking time in a way that felt more noticeable than before. I made tea instead of coffee, something I had not done in years, as if changing a small habit might help me feel like I still had control over my own day. The conversation from the previous afternoon replayed in my mind with unsettling clarity, not as individual sentences anymore, but as a pattern of intent I could not ignore. By mid-morning, I found myself sitting at the dining table again, this time alone, staring at the same sheet of paper Daniel had left behind. I had not touched it the night before, but now I finally unfolded it, reading each line carefully, the way I used to read student evaluations, searching for assumptions hidden between structured language. It was not an official document, but it was detailed enough to feel deliberate. It outlined financial arrangements, suggested distributions, and referenced access to my pension as though it were a shared asset awaiting division. The language was careful, but what struck me most was not what it said, but what it assumed, that I would simply agree. I set the paper down, slowly, and leaned back in my chair, feeling something shift inside me that was not anger, but recognition. I had taught long enough to know when a situation was being framed rather than discussed. Around noon, Michael called. His voice was lighter than it had been in person, almost casual, as if nothing significant had happened the day before. He asked if I had looked over the plan, as he called it, and mentioned that they were only trying to simplify things for me. He said the word simplify more than once, each repetition making it sound less like help and more like removal of complexity that included my opinion. I asked him directly who had suggested dividing my pension in that way. There was a pause on the line, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for me to notice. He said it was something all three of them had discussed together, as if unity of agreement would make the idea more reasonable. I told him I would think about it, and ended the call before he could continue. Later that afternoon, Sarah arrived unexpectedly. She did not knock the way she used to when she was younger. She let herself in using the spare key she had kept for emergencies, a key that suddenly felt less like convenience and more like assumption. She brought a folder with her, thicker than the paper Daniel had left, and placed it on the table without waiting for permission. She explained that she and Michael had spoken to someone, a financial consultant, about structuring my retirement income in a way that would ensure stability. She emphasized stability several times, as though repetition could soften the intrusion. I asked her why stability required their control. She hesitated, then said something I did not expect. She said they were worried I would not manage everything properly on my own. The sentence landed quietly, but it stayed in the room long after she finished speaking. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not malice, but certainty, the kind of certainty that forms when someone believes they are protecting you from yourself. I asked her when exactly they had decided I was no longer capable of managing my own life. She did not answer directly. Instead, she said it was not about capability, but about responsibility, and that as my children they had a duty to help. But help had begun to sound like something else entirely. After she left, I remained at the table for a long time, surrounded by documents I had not requested and conversations I had not agreed to. I thought about all the years I had spent teaching young people how to think independently, how to question assumptions, how to recognize when something was being presented as fact without consent. And yet here I was, watching my own children construct a version of my life that no longer required my input. That evening, I placed all the papers back into the folder and set it neatly on the counter, not because I accepted it, but because I wanted to see what they would do when I did not immediately resist. For the first time, I understood that the conversation was no longer about retirement or money. It was about position and whether I still occupied the place they had already begun to move me out of without asking. Over the next several days, I began to see my own life differently, not because anything around me had changed, but because I could no longer ignore the pattern forming in front of me. After Sarah left that afternoon, the house returned to its usual silence, but it no longer felt like peace. It felt like observation. Every room seemed to hold echoes of conversations I had not fully understood at the time, small moments I had once dismissed as ordinary, now resurfacing with new meaning. I found myself moving through my own home more slowly, noticing details I had lived beside for years without question, the framed photographs on the hallway wall, the carefully labeled drawers in the kitchen, the family calendar still marked with events I had organized but no longer controlled. That evening, I opened a small wooden box I had kept in my bedroom for years, one that contained letters, cards, and personal notes from different stages of my life as a teacher and as a mother. Inside were handwritten birthday cards from my children when they were young, drawings they had made, and short messages from years when gratitude felt effortless and genuine. I read them one by one, not because I needed comfort, but because I needed to understand when the tone had changed. Somewhere between those early years and now, The language of family had shifted from appreciation to expectation. I remembered working double shifts during my teaching career, often staying late to grade papers while still managing household responsibilities. I remembered paying for school activities, covering unexpected expenses, and quietly stepping in whenever one of my children needed support without ever framing it as sacrifice. At the time, I never thought of it as anything unusual. That is simply what I believed a mother did. But now, as I sat alone at my kitchen table, I began to see how consistency can sometimes be mistaken for availability, and how long-term support can slowly become assumed entitlement in the minds of those who receive it. The next morning, I received another call from Michael. His tone was different this time, more measured, as if he had decided on a specific approach. He asked if I had made a decision regarding the financial arrangement they had discussed. I told him I had not made any decisions because there was nothing for me to decide yet. He responded by saying that delay would only make things more complicated and that they were trying to avoid future misunderstandings. I asked him directly what misunderstanding he believed existed between us. There was a pause again, longer this time, followed by a carefully constructed explanation about responsibility, fairness, and long-term planning. But underneath the language, I could hear something else forming, a belief that my independence required oversight. After the call ended, I walked into my living room and sat in the chair where I had spent many evenings reading or watching television, but now I could not settle into it in the same way. I kept thinking about the word responsibility and how it had been redefined without my participation. Later that day, Daniel stopped by briefly. He did not bring documents this time, only a smaller folder, and he spoke less than before. He said he understood if I needed time, but he also said that sometimes families needed structure. To avoid confusion later, I asked him when he had started believing I was a source of confusion. He did not answer directly. Instead, he said that things were different now, that life was more complicated than it used to be. When he left, I remained standing in the doorway for a long time, watching his car pull away, noticing how final the simple act of departure felt. That night, I sat at my desk and began writing down memories, not for nostalgia, but for clarity. I wrote about years spent in classrooms filled with children who depended on me for guidance, about parents who trusted me with their children's education, about a career built on structure, discipline, and consistency. I wrote about raising my own children alone after their father passed away, about the years I worked without complaint, about the decisions I made quietly so that they could have stability. As I wrote, I realized something that had been forming slowly beneath everything else. My children had not suddenly changed. They had simply grown into a version of adulthood that interpreted my consistency as permanence and my presence as something that could be managed rather than respected. The following afternoon, I received a printed document in the mail, formal and carefully prepared, outlining financial roles and suggested arrangements in precise language that avoided emotional reference entirely. I placed it on the table and did not open it immediately. Instead, I looked at it for a long time, understanding that what I was witnessing was no longer a conversation about money, but a restructuring of identity. Somewhere between raising them and retiring from my career, I had become something they believed could be organized, assigned, and quietly redirected without consultation. And for the first time, I understood that the real question was not whether I would agree to their plan, but how long I had unknowingly been positioned inside it. The document arrived on a Tuesday morning, placed neatly in my mailbox as if it carried no emotional weight at all. It was a standard envelope, cream-colored, the kind used for official correspondence, and for a long moment I stood in the kitchen holding it. Without opening it, noticing how something so ordinary could feel so heavy. When I finally sat down at the dining table and broke the seal, I expected clarification, perhaps even hesitation somewhere in the wording, but instead I found precision. Every sentence was structured carefully, every paragraph aligned with the kind of language that removes emotion from human relationships and replaces it with terms that sound neutral but feel absolute. It described roles, responsibilities, and proposed financial arrangements involving my pension in a way that suggested it was already understood and only required my agreement. There was no invitation for discussion, only confirmation. I remember placing the pages flat on the table and reading them again, slower this time, as if repetition might reveal something less final, but it did not. What it revealed instead was how far ahead of me the conversation had already moved. That afternoon, Michael came by without calling first. He stood at the door for only a moment before stepping inside, carrying the same careful expression he had been using more often lately, one that tried to balance concern with certainty. He asked if I had received the document and if I had had time to review it. I told him I had read it. He nodded as if that was progress, then began explaining again why structure was important, why clarity now would prevent confusion later. I asked him when clarity had become more important than consent. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the house briefly, as if measuring something he had not noticed before. Then he said that I was taking it too personally, that this was about organization, not control. The word control was not spoken by him, but it filled the space between us anyway. After he left, I remained seated for a long time, listening to the quiet return of the house, noticing how even silence felt different now, less like peace and more like anticipation. The next day, Sarah called again. Her voice was softer this time, almost careful, as if she was trying a different approach. She said she had been thinking about me, about how difficult transitions could be at my age, and how important it was for family to stay involved. I listened without interrupting, hearing how involvement had replaced presence, how concern had begun to sound like supervision. I asked her if she believed I was incapable of managing my own finances. There was a pause, followed by a carefully chosen response that avoided the question entirely. She said it was not about capability, it was about making sure I was supported. I told her I had been supporting myself for more than 4 decades, and that support without respect was not something I needed. The call ended shortly after that. That evening, I went through old records I had kept in a drawer in my bedroom, documents from my teaching years, retirement paperwork, and personal notes I had collected over time. I found pay statements, pension summaries, and legal documents that had always been filed neatly without question. As I looked through them, I realized something that had not occurred to me before. My financial independence had never been in question from a legal standpoint. It was only now, within the context of my family, that it had been reframed as something negotiable. 2 days later, Daniel visited again. This time he did not bring paperwork. He brought a conversation that felt rehearsed but uncertain, as if he was no longer sure of the direction he had been given. He spoke about responsibility again, but this time he hesitated more often, stopping mid-sentence as though reconsidering phrasing. He said they were only trying to help me avoid stress. I asked him when they had decided I could not handle stress on my own. He looked down at his hands and did not answer for a long moment. Then he said quietly that things had changed since their father passed away, that they all felt more responsible for each other now. I asked him if responsibility meant deciding without asking. He did not respond. After he left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the street outside where nothing appeared different, yet everything felt redefined. I realized then that what I was experiencing was not a sudden conflict, but a gradual repositioning that I had only recently become aware of. My role in their minds had shifted from participant to subject, from mother to managed variable. And as I sat back down at the table where all of this had begun, I understood that the next step would not be about what they were asking of me, but whether I would continue to respond as if I still needed permission to exist within my own life. The following week unfolded in a way that felt less like a continuation of my life and more like a quiet rewriting of it without my permission. After Daniel's last visit, I noticed a change in the rhythm of communication. The calls became shorter, more structured, almost as if each conversation had been reduced to a checklist rather than a dialogue. Michael no longer asked how I was feeling at the beginning of calls. Instead, he went directly to updates, asking if I had made any progress reviewing what he called the arrangement. Sarah began to send messages instead of calling, usually short reminders about timelines and decisions, words that felt increasingly detached from any emotional context. I found myself responding less frequently, not out of avoidance, but because each interaction felt like stepping into a conversation where the conclusion had already been written. One morning, I decided to visit the bank where I had maintained my accounts for more than 20 years. The building was familiar, located just off a main street in Sacramento, with large glass windows and a waiting area that always smelled faintly of paper and coffee. I had no urgent financial issue, but I wanted clarity of my own, something untouched by interpretation or assumption. When I met with the financial advisor assigned to my account, I asked simple questions about my pension, my direct deposits, and whether there had been any attempts to access or modify my information. The answers were straightforward. Everything was in order, fully under my control, and there had been no changes initiated by anyone other than myself. Yet as I listened, I realized that the concern my children had been expressing was not based on actual instability, but on perception. A perception that I was moving into a phase of life where oversight was expected rather than optional. On my way home, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, watching people walk along the sidewalk carrying groceries, talking on phones, moving through their own routines without questioning their independence. I began to think about how easily authority can be redefined within a family, not through force, but through repetition of language that gradually shifts meaning. Words like help, support, and responsibility had been used so frequently that they had begun to replace older definitions of trust and respect. That evening, Sarah came by unannounced again. She seemed more emotional this time, her usual composure replaced with visible frustration. She said she did not understand why I was resisting something that was meant to make things easier for everyone. I asked her what part of my current life she believed was difficult enough to require restructuring. She hesitated, then said that managing finances alone at my age was risky. I asked her if she had ever seen evidence of that risk. She did not answer directly. Instead, she said she was worried about what might happen in the future. I told her that concern about the future was not the same as justification for control in the present. For the first time, she did not respond immediately. She simply looked at me as if she was trying to reconcile the version of me she had constructed with the one sitting in front of her. After she left, I walked through my house slowly, noticing how every room contained evidence of a life built independently over decades. The kitchen where I had prepared meals for years, the living room where I had corrected essays late into the night, the hallway where photographs documented stages of a family that once felt unified without negotiation. Yet now, each space felt like it was being silently reinterpreted by others who no longer experienced it from within. The next day, I received another document, this time more formal than the previous one, containing revised proposals and structured options with clearly defined outcomes. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I placed it on the table and sat across from it, observing it as I would observe a problem in a classroom, something that required analysis rather than reaction. I realized then that what was happening was not a sudden disagreement, but a gradual replacement of narrative. My children were not asking me to give up control through confrontation. They were constructing a version of reality where control had already shifted, and my role was simply to accept the outcome. That realization did not bring anger. It brought clarity. And with that clarity came the understanding that the next decision would not be about the documents they were sending me, but about whether I would continue participating in a version of my life that no longer recognized me as its author. The document remained on my table for 2 days before I finally opened it again, not because I was unsure of its contents, but because I needed to understand the mindset behind it with a clearer distance. During those 2 days, my interactions with my children became even more structured, almost procedural. Michael sent a message asking if I had reviewed the revised proposal. Sarah followed with a reminder about scheduling what she called a family alignment discussion. Daniel did not contact me at all, which in its own way felt like another form of communication. When I finally unfolded the document again, I read it not as a mother, but as someone who had spent decades teaching students how to identify intent within language. What stood out was not only the structure of control it suggested, but the assumption that agreement would eventually come through repetition rather than consent. That assumption revealed more than any single sentence. It revealed patience, not mine, but theirs. The following morning, I made an appointment with an independent legal advisor, someone outside of the network my family had begun referencing. The office was located downtown Sacramento, in a quiet building with neutral walls and no personal photographs, which made the conversation feel objective from the moment I entered. I explained everything carefully, focusing on facts rather than emotion, describing the sequence of documents, the conversations, and the increasing pressure surrounding my pension. The advisor listened, without interruption, occasionally taking notes, and when I finished, there was a long pause before any response. What I was told was not dramatic, but it was clarifying. There was no obligation for me to alter my financial independence, no requirement to assign control, and no legal framework that justified the level of involvement being suggested by my children. It was, in simple terms, a matter of perception versus authority. On my way home, I did not feel relief immediately. Instead, I felt a kind of recalibration, as if something that had been gradually misaligned was now being seen in its original position again. That evening, Michael came to my house without calling first. His tone was more direct than before, and there was less attempt to soften the conversation. He asked if I had spoken to anyone outside the family. When I confirmed that I had, his expression changed in a way I had not seen before, not anger, but concern mixed with disbelief. He said that involving outsiders complicated matters that were meant to stay within the family. I asked him when exactly my financial independence had become a family matter requiring internal approval. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he repeated that they were trying to protect me from unnecessary stress. I told him that protection without permission was not protection at all. He left shortly after, without further discussion. The next day, Sarah called again, but this time her voice carried frustration rather than caution. She said I was making things difficult for everyone and that I needed to consider how my decisions were affecting the family dynamic. I asked her which part of my independent life she believed required family approval. There was silence on the line before she said that I was misunderstanding their intentions. I told her I was no longer interested in interpreting intentions, only actions. After the call ended, I sat in my living room and looked at the space around me with a different awareness. I noticed how often my own presence had been reframed as conditional, how frequently my choices were being filtered through external approval before being acknowledged as valid. Later that week, Daniel visited again. He seemed more conflicted than before, standing longer in silence before speaking. He said that things were becoming more complicated than anyone expected, and that maybe they should slow everything down. I asked him what part of my independence he believed needed slowing down. He did not answer directly. Instead, he admitted that they had been discussing things without fully considering how it would feel from my perspective. It was the first time any of them had acknowledged perspective rather than structure. After he left, I remained seated at the table for a long time, not out of confusion, but because I was finally recognizing the full shape of what had been unfolding. This was no longer about money or planning. It was about interpretation of authority within a family system that had quietly shifted without my awareness. And in that realization, I understood that the next phase would not be defined by what they continued to propose, but by whether I continued to respond as if their interpretation had authority over my reality. In the days that followed, I stopped responding to most of the messages that came from my children, not out of anger, but because I had reached a point where repetition no longer added understanding. Every call from Michael, every message from Sarah, every brief and uncertain appearance from Daniel followed the same structure, an attempt to return the conversation to a framework where their interpretation held authority. But something in me had already shifted away from that framework. I began to notice how much energy had been spent not on discussion, but on redefining my position within the family. And now that I could see it clearly, I no longer felt compelled to participate in it. One morning, I received a call from Michael that was different in tone. He did not begin with updates or suggestions. Instead, he asked if I was willing to meet in person to resolve everything properly. The phrase itself carried an assumption that there was still something unsettled, something incomplete that required correction. I told him I was willing to meet, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand how far the narrative had been constructed. We agreed to meet at a small family restaurant in Sacramento, a place we had visited occasionally over the years for birthdays and casual dinners. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, where I could see both the entrance and the street outside. The familiarity of the setting did not ease the tension. Instead, it made it more visible. When Michael arrived, he was not alone. Sarah entered a few steps behind him, and Daniel followed shortly after. They sat across from me in a formation that felt unintentionally structured, as if the physical arrangement mirrored the conversation they expected to have. There was no greeting that lasted longer than a moment, no attempt to revisit warmth. Michael began by saying that they were concerned I had been influenced by outside opinions. Sarah added that my recent decisions were creating unnecessary distance within the family. Daniel remained mostly silent, occasionally glancing between us. I listened without interrupting, not because I accepted what was being said, but because I wanted to understand the language they were now using to define my behavior. At one point, Michael said that my independence was beginning to look like resistance. That sentence stayed in the air longer than the others. I asked him when independence had become something that required interpretation rather than respect. There was a brief pause before Sarah responded, saying that I was not being fair to their intentions. I asked her to define those intentions without referencing my compliance. She did not answer directly. Instead, she repeated that they were trying to ensure stability for everyone involved. I looked at each of them slowly, noticing how often the word stability had been used to describe arrangements that only affected my autonomy. It became clear that the conversation was no longer about understanding, but about alignment. They were not asking me to share a perspective. They were asking me to adopt theirs. After some time, I placed my hands on the table and told them calmly that I had already reviewed everything independently, and that there was no requirement for me to transfer control of my pension or restructure my financial life based on internal family agreement. I did not raise my voice. I did not emphasize emotion. I simply stated it as fact. The reaction was immediate but contained. Michael leaned back slightly, as if recalculating the direction of the conversation. Sarah looked down at her hands. Daniel finally spoke, saying quietly that they had not meant to pressure me. I asked him if pressure required intent to still be recognized as pressure. He did not respond. The rest of the meeting dissolved into shorter sentences, less certainty, more hesitation. When I stood up to leave, I noticed that none of them attempted to continue the discussion. There was no final argument, no resolution, only an uncomfortable acceptance that the structure they had built no longer functioned in the way they expected. I walked out of the restaurant and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching traffic move through Sacramento as it always had, indifferent to personal conflict or internal shifts. For the first time in weeks, I felt a kind of stillness that was not imposed by others, but chosen by myself. And in that stillness, I understood that the dynamic between us had not collapsed. It had simply been revealed. After the meeting at the restaurant, I returned home with a sense of clarity that did not feel emotional, but structural, as if something inside my understanding of my family had finally settled into its correct position. The silence in my house no longer felt heavy or uncertain. It felt defined. For the first time in weeks, I did not check my phone immediately when it rang, and I did not feel the reflex to respond to every message that arrived from Michael, Sarah, or Daniel. Instead, I allowed space between their attempts to reach me and my decision to acknowledge them. And in that space, I began to notice how much of my recent life had been shaped by urgency that was never truly mine. 2 days after the meeting, Michael came to my house again. He did not knock with his usual expectation of immediate entry. He stood at the door for a moment longer than before, as if uncertain whether the familiarity that once granted him automatic access still applied. When I opened the door, he asked if we could talk. I told him he could speak, but I was no longer interested in revisiting arrangements that had already been reviewed independently. He stepped inside anyway, slower than usual, and this time he was alone. He said that the meeting had not gone as they expected, and that Sarah was upset, and Daniel felt confused. I listened without interruption. He then said that they were willing to adjust the proposal to make it more comfortable for me, as if comfort had been the issue rather than control. I asked him quietly when they had decided that my financial independence required adjustment in the first place. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he said that they were only trying to prepare for the future. I told him that I had already prepared for my future decades ago, through work, discipline, and consistent planning, and that what they were calling preparation was actually reinterpretation of what already belonged to me. There was a long pause. For the first time, Michael did not immediately attempt to reframe my words. He simply stood there, looking around the living room as if noticing details he had previously overlooked. Sarah arrived shortly after, without being called. She entered more cautiously than before, her expression less certain. She asked if we could find a way to move forward as a family. I asked her what she believed had stopped us from doing so already. She hesitated, then said that I had been distant. I told her that distance is often what is perceived when expectations are no longer met without question. Daniel followed a few minutes later, standing slightly behind them, not speaking at first. The three of them stood in my living room, not arranged as they had been at the restaurant. but still forming a familiar pattern of alignment. Michael began to speak again, saying they did not want conflict, that they simply wanted clarity about how things would be handled going forward. I looked at each of them and realized that what they were still seeking was not resolution, but confirmation of their interpretation. I told them that clarity had already been established, not through negotiation, but through review of legal and financial reality that existed independently of family discussion. I explained that my pension, my accounts, and my decisions were not subject to internal agreement, and that no amount of repetition would change that fact. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, not into anger, but into something closer to disbelief, as if the version of events she had been constructing was no longer compatible with what she was hearing. Daniel looked down and said nothing. Michael finally asked if this meant I was refusing to work with them at all. I told him I was not refusing anything that had never required their approval in the first place. The words were not raised in volume, but they carried a finality that changed the atmosphere in the room. After a few moments, Michael nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition that the structure they had been relying on no longer functioned. Sarah looked as though she wanted to say more, but did not. Daniel stepped back toward the door first. One by one, they left without further discussion. When the door closed, I remained standing in the center of my living room for a long time, not because I was uncertain, but because I was finally observing my own life without external interpretation. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence did not feel imposed. It felt intact. I walked to the table where the documents had once been placed and removed them completely, placing them into a drawer that I then closed without hesitation. I understood then that nothing essential had been taken from me, only temporarily questioned by those who assumed access implied authority. And as I sat down later that evening in the same chair where this entire shift had begun, I realized that the most significant change was not in what my children had done, but in what I no longer needed to explain to them about who I was or what remained under my control.